I realized something was terribly wrong the moment Dad looked at me like he had rehearsed a verdict hours before we even arrived. I am Allison Pierce, 29 years old, and nothing prepared me for what happened at that backyard BBQ in Phoenix. It should have been an ordinary family weekend. Instead, the second I set my plate down, Dad rose in front of everyone, eyes fixed on me as if delivering a sentence he believed was justified. He pointed toward me and said the words that landed heavier than I could have imagined. "We've agreed you're no longer part of the family. Don't come to any gatherings." For a moment I could not move. I kept thinking about the reason behind this sudden banishment, because as unbelievable as it sounded, it all came from one late payment. One. I admitted my mistake. I explained it. Yet somehow they decided it was enough to erase me completely. How could a single delay turn into a public execution like this? Beside him, my brother stood with his arms crossed, a quiet laugh slipping from him, as if the scene had been created for his entertainment. No one questioned Dad. No one asked for context. The silence around me said everything they thought I deserved. I did not fight back. I simply walked out, drove home, opened my laptop, and canceled every auto payment I had been covering for years, including HOA fees, car insurance, and part of their business expenses. If they believed I was no longer part of the family, then they could live exactly as if I wasn't. The next morning, the family group chat exploded with furious all-caps messages. Before I continue, leave a comment telling me whether you believe a single mistake should ever give a family the right to cut someone out so completely, because I need to know if anyone else has lived through something this extreme. Many months before that, BBQ gathering things in my family had already begun slipping off track, even if no one wanted to admit it. During that time, my days revolved almost entirely around my job at a healthcare facility in Phoenix, where shifts often extended far beyond what was written on the schedule. I moved from room to room with charts in my hands and responsibilities stacked on my shoulders, trying to keep pace with a workload that rarely slowed down. I thought balancing long hours and tight deadlines was the hardest part of my routine, yet the real strain waited for me each time my phone lit up with a familiar name. Mom usually called late in the evening when she knew I had just finished work, and her voice carried a mixture of softness and expectation that I had never truly questioned. The pattern was almost predictable because she would ease into a conversation before mentioning an overdue HOA fee, or a medical payment that required my attention, or the monthly car insurance that Dad could not cover on time. She always explained the issue with the same reassurance that they would handle everything next month, although next month arrived with a new story and another obligation they hoped I could take care of. I kept telling myself that supporting them was the right thing to do because they were my parents, and parents should not struggle alone, but the requests never paused long enough for me to recover from the previous ones. The steady pressure created a rhythm that shaped my entire routine, and I slowly adapted to it, without noticing how much space it consumed in my life. During one of those weeks, I also had to deal with the way my brother moved through life, with a level of freedom that did not align with our reality. It was the first time I fully registered how different our roles had become, so I introduced him properly in my own mind. My brother Ethan Pierce rarely held a stable job, yet never lacked anything he wanted. He always had a clear path created for him, and Mom defended his choices with unwavering loyalty that never extended toward me with the same intensity. After that moment of realization, I began recognizing the imbalance in every conversation that followed. Whenever Mom asked me for another payment, she spoke as if these responsibilities belonged naturally to me, and refusing would mean I had failed the family. Dad remained quieter, but his silence felt like an agreement with whatever burden Mom placed on my shoulders. I knew they did not intend to harm me, yet their expectations created a weight that settled deeper each month. I started noticing how many small loans I had absorbed without calling them loans, and how many emergencies had turned into habits disguised as temporary setbacks. Mom always used the same line whenever she sensed I was overwhelmed. She would say it was only for this month, and things would improve soon, but history kept repeating itself in a way that made those words lose their meaning. There were moments when I considered setting boundaries, yet I convinced myself that doing so would make me appear selfish. I told myself I could manage everything if I stayed organized, paid attention to my accounts, and adjusted my spending, although the emotional toll became heavier than the financial one. Each request chipped away at the energy I needed for my own life, and I began feeling stretched thin without a clear way to express it. I carried the tension with me through each shift and tried to leave it behind when I clocked out, but it followed me home like an obligation that refused to wait until morning. By the time those months passed, the strain had woven itself into every part of my routine, and I learned to move forward without addressing what was slowly wearing me down. I did not know it then, but the imbalance would eventually collide with everything that came next. 1 week before the BBQ, I thought everything between me and my parents was still manageable, even though the pressure around money had become heavier than I wanted to admit. I was halfway through a double shift when Mom called to say she and Dad were planning a short family getaway to Miami. She said they needed someone to cover part of the upfront cost because the prices were rising quickly, and she insisted that it had to be done within the day. I barely had time to breathe between patients, yet I reassured her that I would handle it because helping them still felt like the natural thing to do. I hung up and returned to the chaos of the clinic where my energy was already stretched thin. I moved from room to room trying to stay focused as the shift dragged on longer than expected. My phone battery slowly reached its limit, and by the time I realized it was nearly dead, I had no chance to plug it in. I told myself I would deal with the payment once I got home, but the night slipped away faster than I anticipated. The next morning, I woke up to a string of missed calls and a voicemail from Mom that sounded colder than usual. She said the payment had not gone through and that they had been forced to adjust their plans. I called her immediately to apologize, explaining that the shift had been overwhelming and my phone had run out of power before I could finish everything. I tried to speak calmly because I believed the situation could be resolved with understanding. Instead of accepting the explanation, she told me that I needed to be more responsible and that I never followed through with what I promised. Her disappointment felt heavier than the mistake itself, especially when Dad repeated the same criticism later in the day. Their tone made it clear that they were not interested in hearing anything beyond the missed deadline. Later that afternoon, I received a notification from Facebook. Ethan, who had taken almost no part in family responsibilities, had posted a vague update that felt directed at me even though he never wrote my name. He wrote that some people love acting reliable until something small exposes their true priorities, followed by a series of laughing emojis. The post gathered quick reactions from relatives who already believed I was supposed to handle every logistical detail for the family. I felt a mix of embarrassment and frustration because I had never asked Ethan to step in for anything yet. He had positioned himself as someone who never made mistakes. I considered confronting him, but I chose not to escalate the situation. I needed space to think rather than another argument that would never solve anything. I deleted the notification and switched off my phone so I could return to my shift without the weight of those comments sitting on my chest. That choice did not remove the tension that was building inside me, but it allowed me to stay focused on what needed my attention during the day. The Miami situation lingered in my mind long after the calls stopped, because it revealed something I had been ignoring for too long. They were willing to judge me harshly for a single late payment while overlooking everything I had consistently handled for them over the years. It was the moment I began to understand that something in our dynamic had shifted in a way that no apology could fix anymore. By the time the weekend finally arrived, I could feel a quiet strain settling over my dad's backyard long before anyone served a plate or pulled out a chair. I tried to push past the uneasiness, telling myself it was another ordinary family gathering, yet something about the way conversations paused when I approached told me that I had walked into an arrangement I had not been warned about. People avoided eye contact as if they were following a script I had never read. I took a seat near the edge of the long table, hoping the tension would settle once the food arrived, but the discomfort only sharpened when Dad rose from his chair with deliberate precision. He waited until every relative had gone silent, then he turned toward me with an expression so severe that I felt the air tighten. His voice carried across the table with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. "We've agreed you're no longer part of the family. Don't come to any gatherings." Conversation stopped entirely, forks hovered, and several heads lowered as if they already knew what was coming. It was a declaration delivered like a verdict, not a moment of anger, and the finality in his tone made it clear that this was not a request, but a decision already carved in stone. Mom remained seated beside him without lifting her gaze. She folded her hands in her lap, refusing to meet my eyes, and the refusal said more than any words she could have spoken. Then Ethan glanced in my direction, and the small curl of his mouth revealed how satisfied he was to see me cornered. He made no attempt to hide his amusement, leaning back, as if the scene unfolding was entertainment he had paid to watch. I recognized the distance in his posture, a signal that whatever this decision meant for me, he had been ready for it long before Dad voiced it aloud. I felt several relatives shift in their seats, but no one intervened or questioned the declaration. The silence around the table pressed in on me, yet I refused to give them the reaction they expected. Instead of defending myself or demanding justification, I stood slowly pushing my chair in, with a calmness I did not entirely feel. I told Dad nothing. I offered Mom nothing. I looked briefly at Ethan, who waited for an argument, and denied him the satisfaction. Then I walked away from the table with steady steps, refusing to look back, even when I heard someone whisper, unsure whether to call after me or let me go. The drive home passed in a blur, but the moment I entered my apartment, clarity settled over me like a final warning. I opened my laptop, signed into every account tied to their convenience, and started shutting down each financial obligation I had been maintaining. The HOA payment vanished first, followed by the insurance policies and every recurring charge linked to Dad's vehicles. Each cancellation removed one invisible thread tethering me to the expectations they had built over the years. The process was meticulous, not emotional, and with each confirmation email that arrived in my inbox, I felt the weight of obligation peeling away. There were no dramatic thoughts or lingering doubts when I finished. Only a quiet certainty that I had taken the first step toward a separation they had announced before I ever considered it possible. I closed my laptop once every payment had been terminated, knowing the consequences would surface soon, yet feeling strangely steady in a way I had not felt in years. The next morning arrived with a kind of weighted silence that settled over my apartment even before I checked my phone. When I finally unlocked the screen, the family group chat was already overflowing with messages that piled up faster than I could read them. The tone of the thread had shifted overnight into something accusatory and sharp-shaped by long paragraphs from my parents and shorter, more pointed comments from extended relatives who had never bothered to speak to me directly unless there was gossip to share. Their words questioned my intentions, my loyalty, and even my maturity, as if a single moment at a backyard meal could erase everything I had done over the years. I scrolled slowly through each message, trying to understand how they had crafted a narrative in which I had deliberately disrupted a peaceful gathering. Several aunts typed explanations about how my attitude had shocked the entire table. A cousin repeated one of Dad's complaints as if it were a confirmed fact. Someone else added that I had embarrassed the family without offering any context. Every new block of text tightened the pressure inside my chest, yet I could not bring myself to respond. I set the phone down, took a long breath, then picked it back up because the notifications kept coming. Mom and Dad began calling a few minutes later. I watched the screen light up while I sat motionless on the couch, unwilling to answer when I knew the conversation would only follow the same script. They called again after the first attempt, then a third time. Their persistence had nothing to do with concern. They wanted control, not understanding. I let each call ring until it cut off naturally, and for the first time in years I felt a boundary forming instead of guilt. As the morning moved on, my relatives shifted from group comments to private messages. Their tone blended amusement with judgment, as if mocking me would somehow restore the balance of the family. One wrote that I had ruined a pleasant afternoon for everyone. Another suggested I should apologize publicly. Someone else said that Dad's announcement had been difficult for them to hear, but necessary. I read those lines with the growing realization that none of them wanted the truth. They only wanted a convenient target. Ethan contacted me separately, choosing to text rather than comment in the group chat. His message insisted that I had brought the entire situation on myself. He said Dad had no choice after my behavior, and added that I had hurt Mom more than I realized. There was no acknowledgement of how he had treated me, no sense of responsibility for his role in everything that had happened. His tone implied that he spoke with authority, as if he represented the entire family. I closed the message without replying because engaging with him would only deepen the wound. A quiet clarity settled in during that moment. I opened my laptop and accessed the financial records for the small family business I had quietly supported for years. The initial investment I had provided had helped keep several projects running. My decision to withdraw now felt overdue. I submitted the paperwork without second thoughts, understanding that the consequences would ripple directly toward Dad, who relied heavily on that funding to maintain his plans. The act was simple, but firm. When the paperwork was finalized, I opened a folder that held years of saved invoices and receipts. Seeing the physical evidence of my contributions helped restore a sense of grounding that I had been missing. I gathered the documents into organized stacks, feeling stronger with each page I placed in order. Although the aftermath of the BBQ had created a storm of accusations, collecting these records reminded me that reality was not shaped by their version of the story, but by the truth I carried with me. The following week, a series of events unfolded with a speed that both stunned and clarified everything I had sensed building beneath the surface for years. I had expected silence from my parents after the chaos of the group chat. Yet what arrived instead was a certified notice informing me that Mom and Dad had filed a civil claim accusing me of causing financial harm to the family business through my withdrawal of funds. The language in the document felt cold and distant, as if rewritten by someone who had never raised me. They alleged that my decision had destabilized their operations, and that I had acted out of spite rather than legitimate concern. Reading those lines made it clear that the conflict had crossed a threshold that could no longer be handled privately. I contacted the first person who came to mind, my attorney, Daniel Cross, whose straightforward approach had earned my trust during a previous legal matter. Daniel listened carefully while I explained the situation, from the hostile messages after the BBQ to the years of undocumented financial support I had provided. When I finished, he paused only briefly before stating that my withdrawal of capital was within my rights and fell entirely inside the boundaries of the operating agreement. His tone held the certainty of someone who had navigated similar disputes and recognized when a claim lacked foundation. Daniel reviewed the documents from Mom and Dad, noting the broad accusations and the absence of specific contractual violations. He pointed out that their filing relied heavily on emotional assertions rather than legal substance, which gave us grounds to respond firmly. After confirming that my contributions had never been tied to ongoing obligations, he recommended filing a counterclaim on the basis that Mom and Dad had repeatedly diverted business funds into personal expenditures, a misuse that carried significant liability under state regulations. Following his advice, I authorized Daniel to proceed. He drafted a request for an internal audit conducted by an independent firm to examine the company's financial records. The decision felt necessary rather than aggressive, especially after reviewing years of receipts I had quietly saved, many of which documented expenses unrelated to business operations. Daniel submitted the audit request, explaining that transparency would strengthen our position and protect me from further allegations. When the auditors delivered their preliminary findings, the inconsistencies were too significant to dismiss. Payments labeled as operational costs had been applied to personal travel, home renovations, and unrelated purchases. None of it amounted to criminal behavior, yet the pattern showed a clear disregard for financial boundaries. Daniel read the report with a controlled expression, then told me that these results would shift the case dramatically. The claims against me now appeared retaliatory rather than legitimate. News of the dispute filtered back to extended family members through social media. Ethan made a public post implying that I had betrayed the family once again, avoiding my name, while leaving no doubt about his target. However, the reaction was unlike the earlier chorus of judgment. Several relatives challenged his narrative, referencing the audit results that had begun circulating quietly among those who maintained connections to the business. For the first time, the story was no longer shaped solely by Mom, Dad, or Ethan. The truth had gained its own momentum. As Daniel prepared our formal response, I realized the situation had shifted from emotional chaos to a structured confrontation in which facts carried more weight than accusations. The legal process would be slow, yet for the first time I felt grounded rather than overwhelmed. The truth was no longer confined to my memories. It had been documented, verified, and placed into the hands of someone who knew how to defend it. A few weeks later, the legal and financial consequences that had been developing quietly in the background rose to the surface with undeniable clarity. The internal audit that Daniel requested concluded with a formal report submitted to the state regulatory office, and the findings triggered an immediate review of the family company. What followed was a series of compliance penalties issued for the misuse of operational funds, each grounded in documented transactions that fell outside the permitted scope of business expenses. None of the violations were severe enough to threaten the company's existence, yet the impact was substantial enough to place a financial strain on Mom and Dad that they had never anticipated when they filed their claim against me. The administrative decision included an order requiring them to return the full amount of the capital I had withdrawn, along with statutory compensation based on the value of the funds during the period of misuse. When Daniel explained the decision, he highlighted that the outcome was not a personal victory, but a standard corrective measure under state corporate law. Still, hearing that the funds I had contributed over the years would be restored provided a sense of closure that I had never expected to receive. The court did not frame the decision as punishment. Instead, it recognized that my contributions had been treated informally for too long and that proper boundaries needed to be re-established. The ripple effects extended beyond regulatory penalties. Without the financial cushion they once relied upon, Mom and Dad ended several discretionary expenditures, which immediately affected Ethan. His living expenses had been supported through the company's funds, a fact that became impossible to maintain once the audit results were formalized. Within a short time, Ethan had to vacate the rental home he had occupied and search for temporary work. He sent a few vague messages on social media hinting at unfair circumstances, yet those posts attracted little sympathy. Some relatives aware of the situation through the audit discussions questioned the choices that had led to this outcome. Their responses reflected a shift in how the family viewed the chain of events, and the unspoken favoritism that had shaped so much of my past no longer appeared sustainable. Shortly after the decision was finalized, Mom and Dad attempted to contact me through multiple channels. They sent long messages requesting a conversation, followed by repeated calls urging a chance to talk as a family and restore a connection they claimed had been damaged by misunderstanding. Their tone differed from the accusations they once used, yet the contrast only reinforced how conditional their willingness to communicate had always been. I blocked their numbers after reading the first few messages, aware that any conversation would be driven by financial desperation rather than genuine accountability. Refusing to reconcile was neither impulsive nor vindictive. It was the first boundary I established without hesitation or guilt, a choice shaped by years of imbalance that had taken far too long to recognize. The distance felt steady rather than lonely, and for the first time I understood that peace sometimes comes from refusing to reopen doors that were closed through deliberate actions rather than accidents. When everything finally settled into place, I realized how completely my life had shifted without any dramatic gesture or confrontation. The transition felt quiet, yet decisive, as if the turbulence that had dominated the past months had exhausted itself and left behind a clarity I had been unable to reach until that point. Once the legal matters concluded and the financial boundaries were formalized, I focused on the practical steps needed to create a healthier environment for myself. I found a new apartment on the opposite side of the city, signed the lease without hesitation, and moved within a few days. The space felt unfamiliar at first, yet I adjusted more quickly than I expected because the absence of constant tension allowed me to finally breathe without anticipating criticism or demands. I did not inform mom or dad about the move, nor did I leave any forwarding address. Their numbers remained blocked, and I kept my devices silent whenever the old patterns of checking for new messages resurfaced. The quiet of those first few weeks felt unusual, yet the calm reinforced my decision to maintain strict boundaries. I stopped explaining my choices to anyone connected to my former household, and the absence of those obligations made my days feel lighter. There were no lingering expectations, no emotional traps disguised as family responsibility, and no more cycles of disappointment that followed every attempt to meet standards that shifted according to other people's moods. My routine improved as I invested time in myself rather than reacting to the noise that had filled my life for years. I explored hobbies I once abandoned due to exhaustion, read during evenings without interruption, and created a weekly schedule that centered on my physical well-being instead of financial obligations. The newfound stability highlighted how little peace I had experienced before. It became obvious that the chaos of the past had never been accidental. It had been normalized by repetition. Removing myself from that environment revealed how distorted my sense of responsibility had become. One distant relative reached out shortly after the court's decision circulated among extended family members. She sent a short message expressing support and encouraged me to continue protecting my boundaries. Her message did not request explanations or updates, and she never contacted me again. That single gesture held more sincerity than the elaborate speeches my immediate family had used in the past whenever they tried to justify their treatment. I appreciated her respect for my privacy, which reinforced the idea that support does not require intrusion. As weeks passed, I realized I had no desire to rebuild any portion of the relationships that had shaped my childhood. I did not miss the group chats, the obligatory holiday gatherings, or the sense of heaviness that accompanied every interaction. The distance allowed me to understand that love should not be conditional on compliance or measured by financial contribution. I created a home that reflected my priorities rather than obligations imposed by others. For the first time, I felt entirely responsible for my future, without carrying the weight of guilt that had once defined so many of my decisions. Boundaries no longer felt like a shield against conflict. They became a form of self-respect that guided every choice I made. I no longer reacted out of fear of disappointing the people who benefited from my silence. The peace I found in my new life came not from isolation, but from the realization that I was finally living according to values I defined for myself. The past could remain where it belonged, without overshadowing the parts of my life that still held space for growth. Healthy boundaries are an essential form of self-protection, especially when kindness is repeatedly treated as an obligation rather than a gift. Stepping away from harmful dynamics does not make someone disloyal. It reflects an understanding of personal worth and emotional limits. When people misuse generosity or manipulate responsibility to maintain control, the most powerful response is choosing peace over continued participation. Growth begins when we stop apologizing for protecting ourselves. Thank you for staying with me through the entire story. Your time and presence mean more than you know, and I hope this experience encourages meaningful reflection about boundaries, family expectations, and the courage to choose a healthier path. I would love to hear your thoughts, personal insights, or similar experiences. Please share your perspective in the comments because your voice adds depth to every story told here.